Okay, let me hit record, get that set up. And as we've done with most sessions, we just ask that you would briefly introduce yourself, and then the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Well, thanks everybody for sticking around. So my name is Nicolas Delon. I'm French. I teach philosophy and environmental studies at the New College of Florida in Sarasota, and I work primarily in animal ethics with special interest in moral status and animal agency. This is work in progress, of course. The paper is slightly different than what the abstract promises, but still, I think, in the spirit of what I had planned to do. And I'm not going to be doing much by way of arguing for premises. I'm more interested in exploring ideas here, and especially seeing how different ideas coming from different places cohere together. So bear with me. So my interest, and I'm gonna be sharing with you just a second, sort of longish handout in the chat. Can I do this? Yes, there you go. Word or PDF, as you please. All right, so I'm going to be following that. So the structure of the paper draws a lot on work done by Sue Donaldson and Will Kymlicka, the authors of the influential Zoopolis and subsequent articles, but also draws on recent work in the last few years that has been done on the notion of animal work or animal labor and what rights are attached to animal work and animal labor. And so I'm going to be drawing a number of parallels or analogies between work and play, including games and sports. And I'm going to be using Donaldson and Kymlicka to ask whether we can use games and sports, which I'm going to be mostly talking about as belonging to the same realm of activities for animals. If we can use games and sports as sort of microcosms or models for the sort of agency and participation that Donaldson and Kymlicka see as being key to domesticated citizenship, so the citizenship that domesticated animals would be entitled to. And so my thesis is that indeed we should see games and sports as such models. And indeed, if we do see work or labor as potential sites of participation in a just interspecies society, then there's even more reason to think that games and play and sports would be potential sites of such realization. So that's the general idea that I'm going to be trying to defend here. The handout contains much more than I'm going to be able to do in 20 minutes, but if you're interested in some of those quotes or references, you can use that as a jumping board. So the starting point here is, and so Josh Milburn has said about other papers of his that he's presented that sometimes that kind of work is sort of like footnotes to Zoopolis, and so that paper in particular is another footnote to Zoopolis. So there's going to be a lot of presuppositions being made here about the sort of work that I'm talking about and the premises that they use in their arguments for domesticated citizenship. And so I'm asking you to kindly bear with me. And if you think that the implications of my argument are absurd, then so much the worse for domesticated citizenship. But if you grant some of those premises, I think it has interesting implications. So the starting point is that many domesticated animals are members of our society and members of an interspecies society. And insofar as we recognize them as members, domesticated animals are entitled to some forms of protections that non-domesticated animals are not entitled to. And non-domesticated animals will include what they call liminal animals, including animals that live in urban areas or outside of urban areas, and wild animals. So I'm mostly going to be focusing on domesticated animals here. So political citizenship tracks social membership. So all and only animals who are full-blown members of our societies are entitled to citizenship, which comes with certain rights of participation in particular. Donaldson and Kimlicka and others who were followed in the SERPs distinguish two models of participation. So the sheer presence or mere presence model and the negotiation model. The idea of the sheer presence model is that merely by their presence, some animals, such as dogs, exert some kind of influence on human decision making and policy. Right? So the mere presence of dogs across societies has a different influence to the extent that we allow dogs to behave in certain ways in our public spaces. The negotiation model goes further than that and asks animals for their preferences and values. So we try to solicit animals for the expression of what they care about, what they want to do, what they prefer, and so on and so forth. And so on that second model, we're on a continuous basis of mutual negotiation to coexist in that interspecies society. And that will include negotiation about the terms of work, cooperation, and play, as I will argue. So animals are domesticated animals mainly as a result of domestication, and the skills we have bred them to develop are capable of expressing their preferences and make choices about their environment at home, in sanctuaries, at the local park, or at work. And so the mere presence model tells us something about the precondition of genuine political inclusion, but it's itself insufficient as a form of meaningful participation. So the negotiation model will prove key to genuinely including animals in the citizenship model. So what we need are institutions, practices, and structures that will allow animals to express their preferences, desires, choices, and so on and so forth. And there's two ways that we can do that according to Donaldson and Kimlicka: microagency, or fostering microagency, and fostering macroagency. So first of all, we should democratize the existing landscape. So make the spaces and places in which we interact with domesticated animals more democratic, in that they would be more friendly to the expression of preferences and choices by those domesticated animals. So you could think of having more dog run parks in the city, or enlarging those dog parks, or making more spaces accessible to dogs off leash at certain times, or making more restaurants or stores accessible to dogs, and so on and so forth. So these would be examples of democratizing the existing landscape. Or giving more voice to animals that already cooperate with us. Right? So perhaps giving more leeway to assisted therapy animals or service dogs. The second way of fostering agency is fostering macro-agency, and that means not just fostering or enhancing the agency of animals within the confines of their existing modes of interactions with us, but letting them choose which modes of interactions they want to have with us in the first place. Right? So that requires going further and perhaps doing more ideal rather than non-ideal theory by building what Sue Donaldson has called an animal agora, or a new public multi-species commons, where animals are empowered to co-author the fundamental nature of political community alongside us. So according to that requirement of fostering macro-agency, we need to build spaces where animals will be able to shape the political community itself, rather than expresses their preferences and desires and choices within the political community that we have designed ourselves. All right. So, in a number of chapters of Zoopolis and then subsequent articles, Will Kimlicka on his own, Sue Donaldson on her own, and Donaldson and Kimlicka together have addressed many ways in which we can foster both micro and macro agency, and work or labor is one of them. But the argument I'm trying to make here is that insofar as work is a plausible way of fostering animal agency and asking animals to perhaps sometimes suggest new ways of interacting with us, I think that games and sports are an even more promising way of doing that. All right, so choice, and here I'm quoting Donaldson and Kimlicka, choice to be meaningful needs to be socially structured. It requires that individuals be socialized into particular norms and relationships that help to define the familiar and trustworthy, and that provide a benchmark from which incremental alternatives become meaningful. Further, we need to structure these opportunities so that an animal can make meaningful choices, and then we need to respond to those choices in ways that confirm domesticated animals' agency and set the stage for further opportunities and further choices. So the idea here is that incrementally, we would, on the basis of mutual negotiation, increase the number and kinds of spaces where novel kinds of animal agency would be able to be expressed. Not just more agency within the structures that we have designed prior to asking them to become members, but the new spaces that other animals are capable of suggesting in the interspecies community. All right, so moving along here, that structuring of new opportunities, according to Donaldson and Kimlicka, has two foundations: basic socialization and stable social identity. And what I suggested that games and sports, or at least some of them, could be sites that provide those foundations for structured opportunities for meaningful choice and participation. So we could socialize some domesticated animals into certain kinds of practices where they would become more skillful at navigating social spaces, but also would be able to gain and construct and develop and refine a stable identity. Right? So some examples we could be thinking about here include sled dog racing, running with dogs, including in the established discipline of canicross, disc or frisbee dog, but even more interesting possibilities such as dog surfing, pig swimming, building goat playgrounds, truffle hunting with hogs, and so on and so forth. These are kinds of activities that are done between members of different species, right? So they could involve animals behaving with conspecifics, with members of other species, or with human beings. And those practices, whether games or sports, would provide those animals, insofar as they're interested in them, stable social identities and the opportunities to develop their social skills. And insofar as those activities would provide those foundations, they would provide foundations that are essential to the kind of participation that an interspecies community requires for domesticated citizens. All right, so in the interest of time, I'm moving on and summarizing the next two sections. The first step will be to make room for rights of self-determination. And the second step will involve moving on to utopias and ways we can design utopian games that would fulfill the desire of that interspecies community. So here I'm following Richard Healy and Angie Paper in a recent paper of theirs where they argue, convincingly in my mind, that many animals, insofar as they are agents, are capable of not consent, but assent and dissent, which are normative powers. And insofar as they have those normative powers and have an interest in negotiating on their own terms the ways they live and interact with us, have a right of self-determination. And that right of self-determination is constitutive of a good life for those animals. So that right of self-determination will be key not just to the way we design workplaces for animals, but also the practices I mentioned earlier, games and sports. Right? So those practices can only be genuine contributions to a just interspecies society insofar as these are practices that respect and perhaps even promote and enhance the self-determination of domesticated animals. Right? We should not um, we should not let the right to play and engage in sports and games, we should not let that right turn into a duty to play. Right? That's the idea of macro agency, that we cannot force domestic animals into particular structures of micro agency. We should give them the choice as to which practices they would choose and whether they would engage in any games or sports to begin with. Yeah? That would be a consequence of their right of self-determination. All right, so once we recognize that self-determination is in the interest of and is constitutive of the flourishing of domesticated animals, and that some games and sports can provide the backdrop for the expression of agency and participation that is key to democratic citizenship in an interspecies community, then the question I want to ask is whether we should strive to perhaps replace more. Whether we should replace forms of work with forms of games and play. Yeah? Even if we recognize that animal labor or animal work could be a part of domesticated citizenship, perhaps games and sports would even be better ways for those animals to express their self-determination. So here the two ideas I'm trying to fit together are an idea recently developed by Donaldson and Kimlicka themselves, the idea that the post-work society conception could be translated to apply to domesticated animals, and Berners-Huth's work on games and as the sorts of activities that we would promote and engage in if we were to live in a utopia. So my idea here, in a nutshell, is that in Huth's utopia or in Donaldson's animal agora, there would be lots of room for what Colin English has called ideal playgrounds. So spaces that afford opportunities for people and other animals to not just engage in gameplay, but to create new forms of engaging in gameplay on their own terms, right? Involving self-determination, but also the discovery and appreciation of intrinsically valuable activities. Right? That's Huth's idea of the utopia. In the utopia, we're no longer engaging in merely instrumental activities. The only activities that we will end up engaging in will be intrinsically rewarding or intrinsically valuable. These are the sorts of activities that a post-work society should foster. Right? So activities that we engage in for their own sake rather than as a way of producing material value or earning a wage or cooperating with others in merely contractual terms. So that's the idea, that ideal playgrounds would offer not just opportunities for gameplay, but could be part and parcel of a multi-species public commons. Okay? And that by doing so, ideal playgrounds in the animal agora or in the multi-species commons would help us create new social worlds, especially new social worlds to interact with domesticated animals on a new basis. So I'm skimming through a lot of details. As I said, there's much more than I can cover here. But in conclusion, the ideal playgrounds of the animal agora, right? So I'm combining work by Donaldson and Kimlicka, work by Huth and people who have commented on Huth, including Colin English. The ideal playgrounds of the animal agora could lead us to discover in domesticated animals and in ourselves new capacities. Right? That was the original idea in the abstract of enhancement. Not enhancing us or animals through genetic editing, for instance, but enhancing ourselves by designing new spaces in which our capacities can evolve. So through social, environmental, and institutional design, we could create the conditions necessary to enhance domesticated animals' abilities to engage in gameplay for its own sake, while exploring their own potential and life scripts. Utopian games as a mode of expression of values and preferences are critical to collective decision making interspecies community, right? So if that sort of really tentative argument is correct, with come full circle, and in that utopia, games and sports in which animals were capable of acting on the basis of their right of self-determination, games and sport would actually be better sites for the sorts of participation that animal labor and work provided in the first place. Right? So we're moving away from a conception of the interspecies community that fosters micro-agency, moving away from that model onto a model that fosters more macro-agency, where animals themselves are helping us design the political community and the sorts of activities in which we can engage together. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicholas.
Thank you.
I have questions. Bob, your hand's up.
Thanks. Really interesting paper, Nicholas. So here's the question. I'm not super clear from the presentation or handout whether you see the primary good of sports and games as epistemic, or whether it has some like additional normative value beyond, that's like not reducible to the fact that this just happens to be a very good way of learning these things about non-human animals. Maybe you can speak to that for a quick minute.
Yeah, that's a great question. So it is at least epistemic, and so I think that's a good way to frame it, that we will learn things about domesticated animals, and in a way, domesticated animals themselves will learn things about what they can do. But when we move on to the more ideal theorizing of the animal agora or utopian games, I think there's more going on than just gaining knowledge. That was a really tentative argument, but the idea is that by designing spaces and practices, we can actually not just learn new things about ourselves and new things about other animals, but develop new capacities. And I don't think that would be strictly epistemic, right? So we would be fostering new modes of living if that were a possibility. It might be a remote possibility, but that's the idea, that there would be a sort of self-enhancement through the design of those spaces.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up.
Yeah.
So the follow-up question is, so that's helpful. Thank you for clarifying. But then I take it you're not committed to the strong claim that this is the only or necessarily even the primary way that this kind of both learning and capacity creation could occur. It's just a way, and perhaps an especially good way, but you're not even sort of taking that much of a stance relative to all the other things that someone might. Okay.
Yeah, no. I'm more and more attracted to the idea that it's perhaps a better way of doing so, but not necessarily the only one. And even Donaldson and Kimlicka would agree that if animals want to work, then that just like go for it. So no, it's part of a portfolio. But one of the interesting implications, getting back to your question about normative, is that once we've self-enhanced and developed those new capacities, and when animals have done so as well, there are normative implications in that the more capacities you have, perhaps the more rights you have, or different rights will emerge, and perhaps ways of treating animals that could be permissible today will no longer be permissible when they have evolved those capacities, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
I thought of in Nicholas's answer there, I thought of Suits's line where he says that a good golf swing is perfectly useless in ordinary life. It's a capacity that has no use outside of golf. And it's interesting too. I don't know if you've seen these. The market now has puzzles that dogs have to solve in order to get food. Have you seen these? They're like neat little kits, and so you put food in these compartments, and they have to open them in a sequential way. My dog nature provides no such puzzle for her, and yet she does seem to enjoy. I don't know if she enjoys it. She probably just wants the damn food, but it's plausible that she may enjoy it. anyway, just a comment. But I do have a question, Nicholas, or you can
Yeah.
comment on that. I still don't quite understand the distinction you're making between micro and macro agency, or maybe it's not your distinction. Could you just explain that to me a little once again, I guess?
Yeah. So, think about seeing eye dogs or service dogs more generally. There are ways to have service dogs work with more freedom about, how much rest they get, what they eat, where they sleep, and so on and so forth, how they interact with their person they're serving, and so on and so forth. Ways of enhancing those freedoms within those confines would be forms of micro agency. Macro agency would be asking the domesticated animal, would be offering a number of opportunities to a domesticated animal and seeing which one they prefer, right? So asking them whether they want to be, or finding a way of knowing whether they want to be a service dog in the first place, rather than putting them in that box and then maximizing your freedom within those limits. Right? That's basically the idea. But getting back to your previous point, I think that notion of obstacles is going to be really key to the value of games and sports here, and obstacles being key to the definition of games according to Suits. And there was tons of studies of animals on farms or sanctuaries or in lab studies that really prefer activities in which there are obstacles to overcome to just getting the goods they would get directly. So when you give them the choice between getting something through some effort, they will, many of them at least will prefer doing that than just getting the fruit of their labor without the labor. I see there are questions in the chat from DealChat too.
Yep.
So we can
maybe pick and choose from that, Nicholas, if you like.
Yeah. So I think the second question was sort of answered when Bob asked me about whether game and play would be only form of self-expression. Great. So I'm going to take the third question about undomesticated animals that have to migrate to further areas away from disturbance. Would that not be causing negative effects if the new generation would not be able to see different animals if we created more dog parks? Yes. I did not address that question, but clearly, if in order to create more spaces for macro agency of domesticated animals, we keep encroaching upon the habitat of semi-wild or fully wild animals, then there are going to be trade-offs. Delon and Kimlicka are cognizant of that, and so their three-tier or three-part model of sovereign wild communities, denizenship for liminal animals, and citizenship for domesticated animals, that full framework would lead us to adjust how much we can expand the spaces of the domesticated community without infringing upon the rights of the denizens or liminal animals or the fully wild animals. So that's definitely going to be a concern. But one interesting implication of their model is that they allow some overlap and sometimes relocation between the liminal animals and the domesticated animals. So some domesticated if we give them macro agency, some domesticated animals will actually exit our society and become feral or stray. Yeah? So they have a right of exit. But by the same token, some liminal animals, so think of raccoons or coyotes or pigeons, might choose to become full-fledged residents of our societies, and perhaps with some conditions become citizens, and even though they are not technically domesticated. So it could be that we should design spaces where pigeons, raccoons, and coyotes should have opportunities for play, but stop bothering about feral horses or stray cats that do not want to interact with us, right? So I talked mostly about domesticated animals, but it could be that some domesticated animals will not engage in games and sports because they just don't want to have to do with us. But it could also be that some wild animals would be concerned by the framework I developed here. Yeah.
Well, thanks very much, Nicholas. Boy, have I enjoyed this talk. I think it was a fantastic one as our final paper in the presentation. And it gives me, working in the world of animals, practically and academically, it's often very negative and heartbreaking and so on. But your paper really makes me feel a little more optimistic about this idea of incorporating animals as citizens. And Kimlicka has talked about that quite a bit, but this idea of giving them more modes of expression and agency, it's really positive. Here in our city, dogs are forbidden in just about every place, and we had a new bar that opened with a huge outdoor space, and it right on the river. And it has become probably the most popular place in town. People go with their dogs. They allow dogs inside. It has been fantastic. And about a month ago, somebody complained. One person complained, and the whole place, they had to ban dogs. Public health was involved, and so on. Anyway, there was an incredible uproar by hundreds, maybe more than hundreds of people, and dogs are once again allowed back at this place. And it has been amazing. It really has. That this idea that dogs, I don't know what the population is, maybe 40% of households in our city have dogs. This is really quite incredible. And maybe this is the beginning here of this idea that dogs are citizens.
Yeah.
Demi-citizens. So, yeah.
I strongly recommend, so it's in the references, but Susan Olsen's paper on the animal agora, where in the last section she imagines the community of Riverside, and it sounds crazy when you read it, but it's fascinating. And she describes ways in which many domesticated animals would be allowed to engage freely with some rules, obviously, for coexistence, but engage freely in all sorts of activities. And there could be a river or ponds or lakes where dogs could swim, humans could swim, but pigs could also go swimming, right? Yeah. So there could be a pig section, or there can be a dog section, or perhaps if children want to swim with the pigs, they could do that, as long as this is compliant with the rights of self-determination of everyone. But the when you get out of the box and try to think about those new possibilities, it gives some hope. So I actually hadn't planned initially to talk about utopia, but I thought that since that was going to be the last, ending on a utopian note would be a nice thing.
Yes, fostering new ways of living, as you said.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for the comments and the questions.
That's our time for the session and the conference. So thanks to everybody who's been participating and asking questions and all your work. And it's just really exciting. A lot of the stuff that we're doing. Yes.
And I would like to thank all of you for coming to the conference and participating and preparing your work, sharing your ideas with all of us. It has been fantastic. It literally has been an international conference. We haven't had anyone from Australia or New Zealand, and perhaps the Southern Hemisphere time difference was just a little bit too challenging. But otherwise, we really had an incredible representation and phenomenal ideas shared here. And I also do want to thank my co-host, Sam Morris. He has done an incredible amount of work on the conference and has been a superb co-host. This has really worked out exceptionally well. So I'm so pleased that all of you are here. And Sam, really thank you from the bottom of my heart for all your work. And
all the same to you, Gabriella. Thank you.
and we didn't want to commit to anything, but I certainly hope that we have another iteration of this conference coming up, and something that we had discussed. We wanted to do more and more and more with the conference, but of course our bums are all numb at this point. We're all zoomed out and everything. So what we were thinking about is perhaps in upcoming months is having some panels. One I'd love to see in particular is on recreational fishing and sport fishing and that sort of thing. And I spoke to Dinesh Wadiwal about participating, and he was pretty keen. And another one on horse racing or equine sports. So not so much a conference, but more a panel, so one-off events. So thank you again, and we will certainly be in touch with all of you.
Thanks, everyone.